On a page of vellum, in an Old Norse manuscript that has been copied so many times, the hand that made the earliest version is now centuries removed from whatever hand produced the one that survives. Two words have been pressed together into one. The ink is dark at the center of each character and slightly faded at the edges, where the quill's pressure was lightest, and where over time a reader's thumb has rested and rested again. The word that results from this joining is Helvegr. It sits on the page with the quiet authority of a geographical term, not a metaphor, not a poetic image, but a name given to a specific road that the Norse tradition held to be as real and as precisely located as any road in the world above. The first half of the compound is Hel. In the oldest layers of the Norse tradition, this word designated both a place and the figure who governed it, a realm lying beneath the known world, beneath the roots of the great world tree, beneath the cold and the dark that deepened as the road descended. The word itself carries no fire, no drama of the kind that later traditions would attach to underworlds. It is a cool, quiet word, two letters in the Old Norse, a sound that falls rather than rises, Hel, the direction already implied in the syllable, downward, inward, away. The second half of the compound is Vijor. This is the ordinary Norse word for road, or way, or path, the same root that appears in the word for wagon, in the verb meaning to travel, in the carved stone inscriptions that commemorative rune stones place beneath the names of men who died on journeys and were never brought home. Veir is a practical word. It names the thing that lies under your feet when you are going somewhere. It does not embellish. When pressed against Hel, it makes something precise out of what might otherwise have remained vague. Not the region of death in some general sense, not the air that smells of endings, but the specific road, the road itself, the way that leads there and nowhere else. Helvegr, the way to Hel. The name appears in the Eddic poem Baldur's Draumr, a poem whose title translates as Baldur's Dreams, in the account of Odin riding toward the realm of the dead to wake a dead Volva, a seeress, and ask her what the dreams of his son Baldur portend. The poem opens with Odin already in motion, already on the road. The narration does not pause to describe his departure, does not linger on the moment he left Asgard and turned his horse toward the north and downward. He is simply there, already descending, the road already running ahead of him into the dark, and the poem picks up at the point where the journey is underway, and the direction is fixed, and there is no longer any question of turning back. In Baldur's Draumr, Helvegr is named as the place where Odin travels, not as an image, but as a location, a documented road with a documented name, traveled by the documented figure of Odin on a documented horse, in a poem whose age places the word itself in the oldest recorded stratum of Norse cosmological geography. There is something in the way the poem begins mid-journey that rewards attention. Odin on the road is not a scene being set. It is a scene already in progress. The road preceded him. The road was there before he turned toward it, before the particular question that sent him downward arose, before Baldur's dreams made the journey necessary. Helvegr does not belong to Odin. He is simply a traveler upon it. In this telling, the most distinguished traveler the poem had the means to produce. But a traveler nonetheless, using what the road offers to any who set foot upon it, a way down, a direction that does not waver, a destination that does not move, a destination that does not move. The tradition is careful about where this road leads. In the Prose Edda, Snorri Sturluson places the realm of Hel with geographical precision inside the structure of the Norse cosmos. The structure itself is the great ash tree Yggdrasil. whose name in Old Norse has been interpreted as something like the horse of the Terrible One, Ygr being one of Odin's many names, Drasil an archaic word for horse, giving the world tree a character that is already strange before any of its specific features are described. Yggdrasil is not a metaphor in Snorri's account. It is a real tree, enormous enough to contain or connect all 9 of the worlds that Norse cosmology identifies, its branches spreading above and its roots extending below through 3 distinct directions into 3 distinct places of cosmological significance. The first root of Yggdrasil, in Snorri's account in Gylfaginning, extends toward Asgard, the realm of the Aesir, the principal gods of the Norse tradition. Beneath that root lies the Well of Urthur, the Well of Fate, where the 3 Norns who govern the weird of gods and men sit weaving and spinning and recording. The second root extends toward Jotunheimr, the realm of the giants, and beneath it lies the Well of Mimir, whose waters hold wisdom, and from which Odin once paid a price, the tradition records as an eye. These 2 roots give Yggdrasil a kind of balance, one toward the gods, one toward their ancient adversaries, each with a source of water beneath it that holds something the cosmos requires. The third root is different. It does not reach toward any inhabited realm of the living. It descends toward Niflheim, the world of mist, the cold and dark primordial region that the Norse tradition understood as one of the 2 conditions from which the world was made, a realm of ice and freezing cold, old beyond the age of the gods, holding at its center the spring Helvegr, from which rivers flow outward through the dark. And beneath the third root of Yggdrasil, in Niflheim, is where Snorri places Hel, not adjacent to it, beneath it. The root does not merely extend in that direction, it terminates somewhere below, in a place of cold ground and darkness, and Hel lies under that root in the specific sense of being sheltered by it, positioned beneath it, the way a thing rests under a great beam of stone. The direction of Helvegr was therefore established by the cosmological structure itself. It runs downward because the destination is genuinely below. The road follows the third root of the tree. It is worth holding that image for a moment, not the whole of Yggdrasil, which is vast enough to be overwhelming, but specifically the third root, a root thickening as it descends. Roots by nature go down, and Yggdrasil's third root follows what its nature requires, growing away from the light, away from the inhabited worlds where gods and giants and humans move through their stories, thickening as it goes deeper into cold ground, until at some point below the level where the other roots run, it disappears into the dark beneath the dark, into a place where even the cold that characterizes Niflheim is enclosed by something older and more complete. Helvegr runs alongside this root, or beneath it, or follows its direction downward. The sources are not precise on which of these, but the relationship between the road and the root is consistent. The root establishes the direction. The road follows. Snorri Sturluson records in Gylfaginning that when Hermod rode this road to plead for the release of the god Bald from Hel's domain, the journey took 9 nights. The specific number is given without elaboration, as though 9 nights were the established and well-understood duration of the passage, the way a traveler might know without being told that a particular mountain crossing would take 3 days, or a particular sea voyage a fortnight. 9 nights on Helvegr. Snorri describes the country that Hermodr rode through during those 9 nights in 4 Old Norse words that have become some of the most discussed in the study of Norse underworld geography. Dilar og Myrkvar, deep and dark. The valleys on either side of the road were deep and dark, not cold, not silent, not strange, not terrifying, deep and dark. The description has a plainness that functions almost like understatement, the way the most certain geographical facts are sometimes the ones that require the fewest words. Dilar, plural of dalgr or dollar in some readings, valley, cleft, the space between walls of stone or earth. Myrkvar, dark, not the dark of a room without a lamp, not the theatrical dark of a place that invites dread, but the consistent and documentable dark of a road that runs through valleys deep enough that their walls block whatever light might otherwise exist. 9 nights of this, which is to say, 9 nights in which the valleys on either side were deep enough to constitute walls, and the road ran between them through continuous dark, when there was no lightning of any kind to indicate morning or noon or any of the hourly changes that mark time for a traveler in the world above. The number 9 is not incidental. Across the Norse tradition, 9 appears at moments of transformation, at thresholds that require a defined and completed duration before whatever comes next can begin. Odin hung for 9 nights on Yggdrasil, suspended on the tree by his own spear, in the act by which he won the runes from the darkness below the roots, the same direction, the same tree, the same downward reach. The Norse cosmos contains 9 worlds, arranged across the structure of Yggdrasil in a number that the tradition treats as complete, as encompassing all that exists. 9 nights on Helvegr places the road inside this same pattern. The passage is not arbitrary. It has the specific duration that the tradition reserves for transformations, for the time required to move from one condition to another in a way that cannot be reversed or abbreviated. 9 nights is how long it takes. The road is exactly that long. It neither shortens nor extends itself for any traveler, and the tradition does not record any instance of a traveler cutting the journey short. Hermodr on Sleipnir rode those 9 nights in full. Sleipnir is Odin's horse, and the tradition describes him as the greatest of all horses, 8-legged, gray, capable of traveling between the worlds in a way that no ordinary horse can manage. The 8 legs are not ornamental. They appear in the visual record of Norse art, on carved stones, and in the descriptions that Snorri and other compilers preserved, as a consistent feature that distinguishes Sleipnir from all other horses, and that the tradition associates with his supernatural capacity for crossing thresholds. An ordinary horse crosses the ground. Sleipnir crosses what is between worlds. On the 9th night of the journey down Helvegr, in the valley where the walls of stone were highest, and the dark was most complete, the road had taken its full measure of the traveler, and whatever lay at the end of it was close enough that the next step forward would begin to approach it, rather than merely extend the passage. The 9 nights matter also because of what they exclude. There is no account in the surviving sources of what a traveler on Helvegr sees or does during those 9 nights, other than the valleys and the dark. The road does not offer encounters or tests or intermediate landmarks during the 9-night passage. It offers passage. The darkness is not punctuated. The valley walls do not open onto anything. Hermodr rode, and the road ran ahead of him, and for 9 nights there was nothing to report but the steady rhythm of 8 hooves on cold earth, and the darkness of the valleys on either side, each night folding into the next without interval or relief, or the kind of marking event that gives a journey its shape and memory. What Helvegr offers is not experience in the usual sense, but passage in a more austere sense, the movement from above to below, from light to dark, from the warm world where the living come to other affairs, to the cold place beneath the roots where the dead receive their travelers. The ship Hemringhorni marked, for the Norse tradition, the moment when such a passage began for Baldur. Baldur was the son of Odin and Frigg, and the tradition treats his death as the great calamity toward which the earlier parts of the Eddic mythological cycle build. His murder by the blind god Hod, guided by Loki's knowledge and Loki's manipulation, is the event that tilts the cosmos toward its eventual dissolution. But before any of that larger weight is felt, before the cosmological consequences of Baldur's death become legible, there is the practical matter of the funeral, and the funeral belongs to Midgard, to the world of shores and water and fire, before anything else. Hringhorni was the greatest of ships. The tradition holds that when the gods prepared Baldur's funeral pyre on the ship, they could not launch it. The vessel was too heavy, built on too great a scale for the usual methods of putting a ship to sea. They sent for a giantess named Hyrrokin, who came riding a wolf with serpents for bridles, and who pushed the ship from land with a force that set fire to the rollers beneath it and shook the earth. The ship reached the water. The pyre on it was prepared. Baldur's wife Nanna died of grief at the pyre's edge and was placed beside him, and then Hringhorni was set alight and pushed outward onto the sea, moving away from the shore, the fire reflecting in the water below the hull, the ship carrying its cargo of grief and flame out toward a horizon where it grew smaller and eventually disappeared. What the people standing on the shore witnessed was the end of Baldur's presence in the world above. What the Norse tradition held was that a passage was simultaneously beginning that the shore-bound mourners could not see and would not follow. Hringhorni moved outward on the water, but Baldur moved downward along the road. The burning of the ship was, in the tradition's understanding, the beginning of the transit, the moment from which the 9 nights would be counted. The fire marks it. The grief of those standing on the shore marks it. And then the road receives the dead, as it receives all who come to it in the ordinary way of death, and carries them downward through valleys that are deep and dark, through 9 nights that constitute the full and documented duration of the passage, to wherever the road ends and the realm below the third root begins. The Eddic poem, Baldur's Dramar, opens with Odin already in motion along this road, already past whatever beginning there might have been, already in the body of the journey. This is worth returning to, because the choice to begin the poem at that point, rather than at Odin's departure, carries something of the road's character within it. Helvegr does not have a spectacular beginning. There is no gate at the top, no marked threshold where the world above ends and the descent begins. Or if there is, the tradition does not dwell on it. The poem is not interested in the moment of entry. What Odin encounters on the road is not drama, but direction. The road runs forward. The road runs downward. The horse's breath is visible in cold air, and the cold is not the cold of winter in the world above, but the cold of altitude lost, of depth gained, of the air at the bottom of a valley that does not warm when the sun moves, because the sun's light does not reach it. The cold is the cold of going down. That cold is consistent across the accounts. Helvegr runs through deep valleys, and the character of those valleys is cold and dark, in the way that deep places are cold and dark, not because darkness is frightening or cold is punishing, but because depth means less light and less warmth, and the road goes nowhere but deeper. The tradition does not suggest that the cold of Helvegr is a torment or a test. It is a geographical feature of a road that runs through deep and dark valleys for 9 nights. The cold is there in the way that the slope is there, because the road goes down, and going down means encountering the conditions of depth. There is also something in the consistency of the road's description that deserves attention. Dilila, okay, Maikva. The valleys are deep and dark for the full 9 nights. They do not vary. The road does not open into clearings or rise to give a view of the wider landscape or offer a single night of less oppressive dark that might serve as a rest from the descent. The 9 nights are characterized by the same conditions from the first to the last, and the duration that makes the passage 9 nights is not broken into stages with different qualities. This is unusual in the tradition of heroic or mythological journeys, which tend to organize their routes around encounters, tests, and transitions that give the traveler something to report. Helvegr offers none of this. It offers only the consistent conditions of its own geography and the reliable duration of its own length, and that consistency is itself a kind of information about what the road is for. The road is for arriving, not for encountering or testing or transforming in ways that require narrative attention. The transformation that Helvegr performs is the simplest possible, the movement from one location to another across a distance that is measured in nights rather than miles, because the road does not belong to the world where miles are counted. By the end of 9 nights, a traveler is where the road leads. That is the entirety of what the road offers, and the tradition presents it without apology or amplification in 4 words that describe the character of the valleys through which it runs. When Hermothr set out on Sleipnir, he did not set out into unknown country. The road had been there before him. It had carried travelers before him, was carrying them still, the ordinary dead of the 9 worlds moving along it in the ordinary continuous procession that death generates among the living. Hermothr's journey is remarkable in the tradition because he was living, riding on a horse. The tradition had specifically equipped for the crossing of cosmological thresholds, undertaking the passage in the full alert awareness of a rider rather than in whatever condition the dead inhabit when they make the same passage. His ride is documented in some detail in Gylfaginn. Snorri records not just that Hermothr rode for 9 nights, but what the valleys were like, what the duration was, what he encountered at the road's far boundary. This level of detail, unusual in the surviving accounts, gives Helvegr something close to a full topographical sketch. The beginning, characterized by 9 nights of dark valleys, the duration, established by number as cosmologically significant, the destination, positioned beneath the 3rd root of Yggdrasil in Niflheim. The road is mapped, in the old and patient sense, not photographed or surveyed, but traced in words by a narrator who had access to sources that no longer fully survive, working from material that was itself the product of centuries of transmission. To trace that map by the light available to the tradition, by the ink on vellum, slightly faded at the corners, by the Eddic poems preserved by writers who were already centuries from the beliefs they recorded, is to find a road that is longer and more carefully drawn than might be expected. Helvegr is not a vague direction. It is a documented road with a documented name, a documented duration of 9 nights, a documented description of its character as deep and dark, and a documented cosmological position beneath the 3rd root of the world tree. It appears in more than one source. Miko. It was written by more than one traveler in the tradition. Its name was compound enough to preserve its meaning through centuries of linguistic change. Hel, the place Veg, the road to it, so that the word itself still carries the full weight of what it names. On the 9th night, the values are all at their most extreme. The valleys are deepest where the road has descended furthest. The dark is most complete where the walls of stone have risen to their greatest height above the traveler below. The cold has accumulated through 8 nights and shows no sign of lessening in the 9th. And the road runs ahead, still with no visible end, still through country that the tradition describes only in the terms that have been consistent since the first night. 9 nights is the measure. On the 9th night, the measure is nearly full, and the traveler knows it, not because anything visible has changed, but because the count is nearly complete, and the count was established before the journey began, and it has been kept by the road itself, not by landmarks or by the lightning of the sky, or by the appearance of any feature that would say the passage is ending. 9 nights is also a duration long enough to forget the world above. Not in any dramatic or permanent sense, but in the ordinary sense that 9 nights of deep valleys and cold dark leave the memory of sunlight and open sky at a distance that is no longer immediately available. A traveler on the 9th night of Helvegr is not newly arrived. The road has had time to do what the road does, which is to carry its travelers further from where they began and further toward where the road leads, night by night, through the consistent geography of the descent. By the 9th night, the world above is 9 nights behind. The road ahead is unknown, though its direction has been consistent and gives no reason to expect a sudden change. Whatever the destination is, it lies ahead, somewhere in the dark, that continues past the 9th night's end. The road stretches ahead. 9 nights of valley walls, and cold and dark, measured out in a number the tradition treats as complete and whole, and sufficient to the task of transformation. No single lamp lights the passage. No voice from above calls the traveler back. The road runs forward, downward with the patience of a geographical feature that has been in place since before the gods arranged the 9 worlds across the branches and roots of Yggdrasil, since before the tree itself was something other than the primordial material from which the world would be made. Helvegr does not need to announce itself or explain itself or dress its length in incident. Its length is its character. Its dark is its description. And the 9 nights of its passage constitute a corridor that the tradition traces with the calm precision of a surveyor who has walked the road many times and knows exactly how long it is and exactly what is at the end of it, and sees no reason to make the distance seem other than what it is. At the far end of those 9 nights, the road arrives somewhere. The valleys open into something. The darkness that has been consistent for the full length of the passage reaches a point where it becomes the darkness of a place rather than the darkness of a road in transit, where the traveler is no longer moving through the dark but has arrived in it, and the road has delivered what it promised when it first ran downward from the world of the living, and the 9 nights are complete, and the passage is done. The tradition does not describe the transition from road to destination as a dramatic emergence. The dark is continuous. The arrival is quiet. What changes is not the quality of the air or the warmth of the light, but the simple fact of having arrived, of the 9 nights being behind, and the destination, carefully recorded and precisely located beneath the 3rd root of Yggdrasil, being ahead. For 9 nights, the road is all there is. Valley walls on either side, too high and too close to admit any sky. Cold that does not lessen, dark that does not thin. The steady sound of travel, 8 hooves on cold earth, or the quieter passage of the ordinary dead, whose manner of travel the tradition does not specify, but whose destination is the same, carrying forward through a geography that is consistent and documented and exactly as long as the number 9, which is to say, exactly as long as the tradition determined it should be, in the same way that 9 hangs in Odin's account of the runes, and 9 worlds fill the branches and roots of the tree, and 9 is the number that the Norse tradition returned to when it needed to say that a thing was complete and had taken its full and proper measure of time. 9 nights, the corridor of the road, no visible end, and the cold air of the valleys pressing in from either side, and the road continuing forward into a darkness that the tradition records without alarm and without apology as the documented character of a very old and very carefully named road that runs from the world of the living to the realm beneath the roots. In the dark beneath the world, before the gods had names for the places they had made, there was a spring. Snorri Sturluson records it in Gylfaginning, the spring called Helvegr, sitting in the cold of Niflheim, the oldest realm in the Norse account of what existed before anything was shaped into order. From Helvegr, 11 rivers ran outward in the dark, not tributaries of some larger system, not streams that had wandered from a central source by accident. 11 rivers, named individually, spreading out across the cold of Niflheim, the way roots spread from the base of a great tree, purposeful in their arrangement, ancient in their source, each one carrying water cold enough that it thickened as it traveled, turning to ice at its edges, the ice building outward into the void that the tradition calls Ginnungagapap. These rivers had a collective name, the Helvegr, and the spring they came from was old enough that the Norse tradition places it before the formation of the world, before the gods, before the giants, before anything was made from the body of the primordial giant Ymir. Helvegr was simply there, in the cold dark of the north, pouring outward, and the Helvegr were the evidence of it. The image is worth sitting with for a moment, in the way that very old images deserve. A source of water in the dark, 11 rivers radiating from it, in the cold, each river carrying a name: Svol, Gunthra, Fjorm, Fimbultil, Sleitr, Heats, Silgr, Jogr, Vit, Leiptr, and Gjoll. 11 names pressed individually into the record by someone who thought it mattered that each one be distinguished from the others, that each river should be known as its own thing and not collapsed into a general idea of water in the dark. The care of that naming is itself an interesting quality of the Norse cosmological imagination, its tendency toward the specific, its preference for the inventory, its conviction that a thing unnamed is a thing not quite real. The Helvegr were not anonymous. They were counted and called by name, and their source was known, and their age was so great that it preceded the conditions under which age itself could be measured. Of those 11 rivers, one runs at the border of Hel's domain, but that particular river belongs to a later point in the road's geography. For now, the spring itself is enough. Helvegr, bubbling in the cold, pouring outward into 11 channels that spread through the oldest and lowest realm the Norse tradition describes. Its water so cold it left ice behind it as it moved, its age so great it had been flowing since before the fire realm of Muspelheim and the ice realm of Niflheim produced the conditions that made the first life possible. Niflheim itself, whose name in Old Norse means something like world of mist or dark world, sits in the oldest layer of the Norse cosmological account. In Gylfaginning, Snorri places it as one of 2 primordial realms that existed before creation proper. To the north, cold, ice, mist, darkness. To the south, fire. Between them, the void. The Norse tradition holds that life emerged from the interaction of these 2 extremes across the gap, warmth from the south meeting ice from the north, the ice melting and dripping, the drips taking the form of the primordial giant Ymir, the cattle Audhumbla licking him free from the ice block in which he was encased. But before all of that, Niflheim was simply cold and dark and full of mist, with Helvegr at its center and the Helvegr spreading outward from it. The realm predated everything it would eventually become part of. It was cold before cold was a condition anyone had named. It was dark before dark was contrasted with anything else. The Norse cosmological system arranges 9 worlds across the structure of Yggdrasil, the great world ash tree, whose roots reach into 3 wells, and whose branches spread into the realms of gods and giants, and the dead. Among those 9 worlds, Helheim occupies the lowest position. Not simply the lowest in status or prestige, the lowest in literal cosmological geography, beneath the 3rd root of Yggdrasil, which the tradition describes as descending through Niflheim and into the cold. If the Norse cosmos is imagined as a vertical arrangement, and the textual sources consistently support this reading, with the gods in their high hall, the humans on the middle ground of Midgard, and the dead in the realm below, then Helheim sits at the bottom of that arrangement, as far below Midgard as Asgardr is above it, the terminal point of a descent that the road called Helvegr makes possible. And into this realm, the Norse tradition holds, come all those who die by means other than honorable combat, not only the wicked, not only the notorious, all those who die of illness, all those who die of old age, all those whose deaths occur in conditions that the tradition does not classify as the battlefield deaths that open the doors of Valhall and Folkvang. That is a category that encompasses the great majority of all the deaths that have ever occurred. Farmers and craftspeople, and mothers and merchants and children, and the old, everyone whose ending was quiet or slow or simply inevitable, all of them traveling the 9-night road downward through the dark valleys and arriving eventually at the realm beneath the 3rd root. The tradition does not frame this as a punishment. It is important to hold that clearly in mind while moving through the geography of the place. Helheim is not a punishment for an ordinary death. It is where the Norse tradition understood the ordinary dead to go, the destination of the great majority of human beings, described carefully and specifically, given a geography and a name and a ruler, accorded the dignity of being taken seriously as a real place with real characteristics. That the characteristics are austere does not make them grim in the sense of condemnatory. The Norse dead in Helheim are simply there, in the cold, in the dark, occupying a place that was made to receive them. Snorri, in Gylfaginning, names Hel's Hall. The name is Eluthnir. The Old Norse word carries several possible translations, none of them architectural in any comfortable sense. Sprayed with snowstorms is one rendering, damp with sleet is another. The name describes weather rather than structure, a hall identified not by its materials or its position, but by what the air inside it feels like, by the condition of the atmosphere that fills it. Eluthnir is the kind of name that suggests someone sat with the reality of the place and chose the most accurate word for it, the word that captured the specific quality of cold and moisture and gray air that the hall embodied. Not a name chosen for grandeur, not a name meant to inspire, a name that simply tells the truth about the climate of the room. The name Eluthnir, spoken slowly, has its own particular quality. Eluthnir, each syllable a small cold exhalation, the long vowel at the beginning settling before the consonants close around it. It sounds like something that belongs to the place it describes, a name that would not be out of place in the dark air of the realm itself, a name that could be spoken quietly in a hall where sleet moved across the floor and no one would be surprised to hear it. Snorri does not stop at naming the hall. He goes further than that, in a passage that reveals something of the Norse tradition's particular approach to the geography of the dead, its insistence on the specific, its habit of naming the individual components of a place, rather than gesturing at it, generally. He names the furnishings of Eluthnir individually, not as an inventory of decoration, but as an inventory of meaning, each object given a name that is also a condition, a name pressed so deeply into the thing it belongs to, that the thing and the name cannot be separated without losing both. Hell's dish is named hunger. The word means hunger, not a dish that resembles hunger, or that evokes hunger, or that serves the kind of food associated with want. The dish itself is named the word for hunger, so that the object and the condition are one. Whatever fills the dish, if anything does, the tradition does not specify, is held by a vessel whose name declares what it means to eat from it. Her knife is named sultry. The word means famine. The implement that would divide food, that in any other hall would be the tool of a feast or a meal, carries here the name of the most extreme form of want the tradition could name, not simple hunger, but the hunger that ends in death, the hunger that empties whole populations, the hunger that has no remedy. Sultry, the knife, the instrument of division, named for the condition of having nothing to divide. Her threshold, the piece of a hall that marks the transition from outside to inside, the architectural feature that every guest crosses on arrival and every host stands across from every visitor, is named Falandafora. The word means stumbling block. The threshold of Eleuthner does not welcome. It does not mark the transition from cold to warmth, from exposure to shelter, in the way that a threshold in a living hall might. It is named for the particular quality of a step that catches the foot, that interrupts the movement of someone who thought they knew where they were going, the small and very particular experience of ground that refuses to cooperate. Every traveler who crosses into Eleuthner crosses Falandaforath. Every one of them stumbles in the naming of the place, whether or not the physical act of stumbling is part of their arrival. Her bed is named Kor. The word means sick bed. The place of rest in this hall, the place where the ruler of the dead lays down at the end of whatever constitutes a day in Helheim, is the name for the bed of someone who is ill, for the specific rest that is not restful, the lying down that does not restore, not simply a bed, the kind of bed that is reached by diminishment, that holds a body that is losing its contest with whatever is wrong with it. Kor. And her bed curtains, the hanging fabric that surrounds and encloses the bed, the last private boundary before sleep, are named Blikyandabul, gleaming misery, in one translation. The curtains glow in the naming of them. They catch what little light reaches the hall and reflect it back. And what they reflect, in their name, is the specific quality of misery that is conspicuous, that shines somehow even in the dark of a hall named for sleet weather, not a dull suffering, not the gray flatness of ordinary privation, a misery that glitters, that has its own strange luminosity, that makes itself visible even in conditions where visibility is not expected. The inventory of Eleuthner: hunger, sulter, Falandaforath, Kor, Blikyandabul, has the quality of something composed by a mind that was thinking very carefully about what it means to be in a place from which the ordinary consolations of life have been removed, not violently removed, not ripped away in punishment, simply absent. The dish is there, the knife is there, the threshold has been crossed, the bed exists, the curtains surround it. All the forms of domestic comfort have been preserved in their outlines, while their contents have been replaced by the names of what they lack. It is a hall where you could recognize every object and find that each one names what it is not. The Norse tradition's tendency to name, to specify, to record the individual components of a place, rather than describe it in broad terms. This tendency produces, in the account of Eleuthner, something genuinely unusual, a hall whose furniture is a catalogue of its own atmosphere, an interior defined not by what it contains, but by what each containing thing is called. The gesture is careful and strange in equal measure, and it suggests that whoever composed this account, whether Snorri himself drawing on older material, or the older tradition he was drawing from, sat with the reality of what Hel's Hall would be like, and named it honestly, piece by piece, object by object, finding in each familiar domestic form the name of what the dead have left behind. Before the named hall, before the catalogue of objects, before the specific cold geography of Helheim itself, the tradition places Niflheim's broader landscape, and within that landscape, one feature receives particular attention in the sources, not only for its location, but for what it holds. Helvegr, the spring, is not only the source of the Helvegr, it is also recorded as the dwelling place of the serpent Nidhogg, who gnaws at the third root of Yggdrasil from below, chewing at the base of the world tree with a patience that the tradition holds has been uninterrupted since the world began. The Völuspá describes Nidhogg at length, a creature at work beneath the world, drawing sustenance from the root itself, its labor so consistent and so relentless that it belongs not to any particular era of the mythological timeline, but to the permanent condition of the world's understructure. The root above Niflheim has always been being gnawed. Nidhogg has always been at work. These are not events that begin and end. They are the condition of the lowest part of the cosmos, slow, cold, persistent, as old as the spring the serpent lives beside. The Völuspá also describes, within Hel's domain, a specific place that the tradition sets apart from the rest of the realm's geography. The place is called Nastrend. The name means corpse shore. It is recorded in the Völuspá as a hall, its own distinct structure within the broader landscape of Hel, and the description of it is precise in a way that rewards close attention. The doors of the hall at Nastrend face north. This is a specific cosmological orientation, and it carries meaning in the Norse tradition that it does not carry in a simple description of a building's aspect. North, in Norse cosmological thinking, was the most inauspicious of the four directions, associated with cold, with darkness, with the realms furthest from the warmth and order of the inhabited world. A hall whose doors face north is a hall that opens toward the most difficult quarter of the compass, that is oriented away from every direction associated with warmth and safety and human habitation. The placement of the doors is not accidental. It is the first piece of information the poem gives about Nastrend, and it establishes the hall's relationship to the rest of the cosmos before anything else about it has been described. The walls and roof of Nastrend are woven from the backs of serpents. The Völuspá is specific about this, not serpents carved in stone or depicted in the architectural decoration of the hall, but actual serpents, their bodies forming the structural fabric of the building. Their heads are turned inward, and from those inward-facing heads, venom drips continuously down through the roof, falling to the floor below, so that the interior of the hall is in a constant state of slow precipitation, the rain falling inside Nastrend, carrying the quality of the creatures whose bodies make the roof. The hall at Nastrend is not for all the dead. The Völuspá is clear on this point. Nastrend is reserved for those who violated the most fundamental bonds of Norse society: murderers, oath breakers, and those guilty of what the tradition regarded as the worst category of sexual violation. The distinction matters because it confirms that Helheim itself is not a place of punishment for ordinary death. The hall with the serpent walls and the north-facing doors and the venom rain is a differentiated space within the realm, set apart from the larger landscape of the dead, in the same way that any organized system of justice sets apart the consequences of specific transgressions from the general conditions of ordinary life. Nastrend is not the whole of hell. It is one feature within it, occupying its specific place in the realm's geography, the way any distinctive structure occupies a particular location within a larger landscape. The venom from the serpent's heads is attended by Nidhogg. The Voluspa places the serpent in connection with Nastrend, gnawing at the bodies of those in the hall, consistent in its ancient labor. The image is not presented in the poem as either theatrical or extraordinary. It is simply reported the way a careful geographic account reports what occupies a particular stretch of territory. Nidhogg is at the root. Nidhogg is at Nastrend. The serpent's presence is noted as a feature of the landscape, ancient and continuous, as old as the spring it lives beside. The landscape of Niflheim, spreading outward from Helvegr across the cold, contains both the specific geography of Nastrend and the general geography of Hell's domain, and the two exist simultaneously without contradiction. The tradition is large enough to hold a hall of serpent walls and a hall named for Sleetweather, a spring from which 11 rivers flow, and a serpent older than the gods gnawing at a root that holds the world in place. The size of the cosmos the Norse tradition describes, 9 worlds arranged across a tree of unimaginable scale, its roots in 3 wells, its branches in the realms of every order of being, is large enough that all of this fits inside it without crowding. Niflheim is enormous by any measure that can be applied to a realm. It has room for springs and rivers and halls and gradations of dead, and a serpent at the root of the world. It has room for all the ordinary dead of all the 9 worlds, arriving by the road that runs downward through 9 nights of deep and dark valleys. There is something of interest in the way the Norse tradition handles the scale of Helheim, the sheer quantity of the dead it receives. Every person who has ever lived in the 9 worlds and died of illness or age or any cause that is not the specific category of honorable combat has gone to hell. That is a number beyond counting. The tradition acknowledges this, at least implicitly, in the way it records the geography of the realm, large enough to hold all of them, organized enough to have named its features, administered by a figure whose authority is described as covering 9 worlds and all who die within them. The scale is not described in terms of crowds or density or the difficulty of finding space. It is simply part of the realm's character. Helheim has always been large enough. The cold has always been wide enough. The dark has always had room for one more traveler coming down the road. In Gylfaginning, the account of Hermothr's journey to Hell on Sleipnir places a traveler inside this geography who can report back on what it contains, or at least on the portion of it through which a living rider on an 8-legged horse can pass. Hermothr arrives in Hell's Hall. He finds Baldur there, in a seat of honor. He stays the night. He speaks with Hell in the morning. The report he brings back through Snorri's account is not of a realm of horror or chaos or suffering beyond description. It is a hall. It has a threshold. It has a ruler. The ruler is capable of receiving a guest, of holding a conversation, of issuing conditions. The geography does not disturb Hermothr. At least the text does not record disturbance as part of his response to the place. He came to ask for something, and he asked, and received an answer, and rode back up the road. The realm received him the way it receives everyone, according to its rules, by its own logic, operating in the manner it has always operated. This is one of the qualities of the Norse underworld that distinguishes it from some other traditions' accounts of the land of the dead, its operation by rule rather than by mood, its governance by a figure with a specific domain of authority and a specific framework of conditions, its geography named and known and consistent. Hell does not change its character depending on who arrives. The cold is always the cold. The hall always has its threshold, and its dish, and its knife, and its bed, and its curtains. The springs always flow. The rivers always run. The serpent always gnaws. The ordinary dead always arrive, from every corner of the 9 worlds, coming down the 9-night road through the valleys, reaching eventually the territory that was made for them, in the sense that a realm made for the dead is a realm made for everything that dies. The image of those rivers spreading outward from Helvegr in the dark, the 11 Helvegr, each named, each cold, each running through the oldest part of the realm, does something particular to the quality of attention brought to the rest of the geography. If the spring is old enough to predate creation, and the rivers are old enough to have participated in the formation of the world, the ice of the Helvegr drifting outward into Ginnungagap and playing its part in the conditions that made life possible, then the cold of Niflheim is not a recent or temporary condition. It is not the cold of a single winter or a single climate. It is the cold that was present before the world was formed, the cold that persisted through the world's formation, the cold that will persist in Niflheim, whatever happens elsewhere. The 11 rivers have been flowing since before the gods. They will be flowing long after anything that can be measured by ordinary time. The Helvegr carry the age of the realm in their movement, watching them spread outward in the dark, imagining them, following their paths through the cold, from the single source at the center, each one finding its channel, each one named and known, each one depositing its ice at the edges as it moves, produces a particular quality of feeling, something between recognition and distance. Recognition, because the image of water spreading from a source is familiar in a way that almost nothing else is. Distance, because the conditions surrounding this water are so far from anything that resembles a warm climate or an inhabited world that the familiarity of the gesture, water flowing from a spring, sits against a background that makes it strange. Cold water flowing from a cold spring through a dark and misty realm into the void that preceded the world. The same gesture, entirely different terms. The spring Helvegr sits at the center of this, older than the gods who named it, older than the worlds arranged around Yggdrasil's trunk, older than the tree itself in the logic of the tradition. From Helvegr, the 11 rivers, from the rivers, the cold, from the cold, in the account the tradition provides, the conditions that made life possible. And alongside all of that, continuous, uninterrupted, operating on a different timeline than the events of the mythological narrative, the realm of the dead, receiving its dead, named and organized and furnished with objects whose names are the names of what the dead have left behind. Hungry, Sultric, Philandifia, Korblik, Yondabur, the dish, the knife, the threshold, the bed, the curtains, each one named, each name a word for a kind of absence, a kind of difficulty, a kind of experience that the living know and the dead have moved beyond. The dish named hunger sits in a hall named for sleet weather, in a realm that was cold before the world was made, receiving travelers who arrive after 9 nights of riding through dark valleys. The knife, named famine, rests beside it. The threshold, named stumbling block, has been crossed by every traveler who has arrived in the hall since the hall was made. The bed, named sick bed, holds its rest in the furthest room. The curtains, named gleaming misery, hang around it, catching what light there is and giving it back as the quality of a suffering that shines. This is the hall as Snorri records it. This is the realm as the tradition describes it, not a place constructed to alarm, not a landscape designed to warn the living away from the paths that lead to it, a place that the Norse tradition thought carefully about, named carefully, furnished with care, gave a ruler with a specific genealogy and a specific authority and a specific name for her hall and every object in it. The care of the naming is itself the most significant quality. A tradition that invents names for the threshold of the underworld and the curtains around the ruler's bed is a tradition that takes the underworld seriously as a real place with real features that deserve to be known individually. The spring flows, the rivers run, somewhere in the cold and the dark and the sleet-laden air of the realm, the hall named for snowstorms stands with its threshold and its objects and their names. The name Eluthnir, damp with sleet, sprayed with snowstorms, hangs in the cold air of the realm, like a breath made visible, each syllable a small exhalation, the whole name settling in the dark, the way breath settles in cold air, briefly visible and then gone. And in the hall, hunger sultrig, fallenda foreth, kor blikjandabud, the dish, the knife, the threshold, the bed, the curtains, each one named, each name a quiet, specific, honest record of a hall that holds the quiet and specific and honest weight of everything that ends. In the oldest layer of the sources that preserve Norse cosmology, Hel is given a mother before she is given a kingdom. That mother's name is Angrabotha. The name is an Old Norse compound, and what it means, held up to the light, is something like she who brings grief, or she who announces sorrow, a name that does not describe a person so much as a function, a foretelling pressed into a word. Angrabotha was a giantess, one of the Jotnar, and what the tradition records of her is almost entirely this, that she lived in a place called Jarnvith, the iron wood, and that from her union with Loki she bore 3 children whose fates were already written into the shape of the world before any of the Aesir moved to address them. Loki himself was many things across the traditions that preserved him. A shapeshifter, a maker of catastrophes, a figure who existed in the spaces between the ordered world of the gods and whatever lay outside it. That he became the father of 3 children, whose natures were as extreme as his own, has the quality of something that could not have turned out otherwise. The union of a god who lived at the edge of every category with a giantess whose name meant the announcement of grief produced, but only in the telling that Snorri Sturluson set down in Gylfaginning 3 offspring, the world serpent Jormungandr, whose body was long enough to encircle the entirety of Midgard and hold its own tail in its mouth, the wolf Fenrir, whose strength was such that the gods eventually bound him with a chain made of impossible things, the sound of a cat's footstep, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, and the 3rd child, a daughter whose name was Hel. 3 children, each of them a boundary. Jormungandr was the boundary of the world itself, the serpent at the outermost edge of the ocean. Fenrir was the boundary of what could be contained, the thing that even the gods could not hold forever. And Hel was the boundary between the living and the dead, the daughter of grief and of the trickster, appointed to hold the threshold no one crosses twice in the same direction. What the tradition gives her, before it gives her a domain, is this parentage, this pairing of lineage and fate so precisely matched that the genealogy itself feels like a myth about origin, the explanation of how the deepest threshold in the 9 worlds came to have a keeper. The Aesir, Snorri records, were not indifferent to these 3 children. The gods had received prophecy. They understood from what the prophecies told them that great harm and ruin would come from this family, from Loki's lineage through Angrboda, and that understanding moved them toward action. Jormungandr was cast into the ocean at the edge of the world. Fenrir was brought to Asgarth and eventually bound, and Hel, the third child, the daughter, was cast downward. Snorri uses a specific and ordinary Old Norse word for this, kastaði, to throw, to cast. Odin cast Hel downward into Niflheim, into the cold and the mist and the dark, beneath the roots of the world, and simultaneously, in the same gesture, the same breath of divine decision, granted her vowed over 9 worlds, and specifically over those who died of illness and old age, of accident and ordinary end, of every death that came to people in their beds, or in the cold, or at the end of a long diminishing. The two actions cannot be separated in the tradition. To cast her down was to give her authority. The exile and the coronation were the same motion. There is no version of this telling in which Hel is sent downward and stripped of everything, cast into Niflheim as simple punishment, with nothing following. What follows is immediate and permanent authority, governance, a domain whose scale, 9 worlds, is equal to the full breadth of the Norse cosmological structure. Whatever Odin intended by the throwing, whether it was fear, containment, the pragmatic management of a figure whose nature and parentage made her presence among the Aesir impossible, what the tradition records as its result is a ruler with legitimate and absolute power over the largest constituency in all of the 9 worlds. Because the dead vastly outnumber the living, they always have. In the Norse understanding of the afterlife, death in honorable battle opened the path to Valhall, Odin's hall, or to Folkvang, the field where Freya received her half of the slain. But honorable battle was only one way to die, and most people did not die that way. Most people died as people do, of illness, of age, of cold winters and difficult births and accidents on the water and long, slow fading. The tradition is explicit on this. Hel received all of them. The great majority of all mortal deaths across all 9 worlds moved down through the dark, down the 9 nights of the road, down into the realm that took its name from its keeper. In that arithmetic, Hel's authority over 9 worlds was not an exaggeration. It was a precise description of her actual jurisdiction. Snorri describes her appearance in Gylfaginning with the same calm specificity he brings to the naming of her hall's furnishings and the description of her road. Half of her, he records, was the ordinary color of living flesh. The other half was blar. That Old Norse word carries a range that English struggles to hold in a single term. It is the color of bruising, the color of sky at its darkest before dawn, the blue-black that spreads across skin, no longer receiving blood. The color the Norse associated most directly with death and with the bodies of the dead. Blar was the word for the discoloration of a corpse, and half of Hel was that color, her body divided between the tones of the living and the tones of the dead, a line drawn somewhere across her that marked in flesh the threshold she was made to hold. She was not, in Snorri's account, described as misshapen or deformed. The detail is not offered as a description of injury or damage. It is offered as a description of what she is, a figure whose physical form is a map of the boundary between 2 states of being. To look at Hel was, in the tradition's logic, to look at the threshold itself in the form of a person. The living color and the death color, side by side, neither overwhelming the other, held in a single body. There is something almost precise about this, the care with which the tradition insists that she embodies the boundary rather than simply guarding it from one side. She is not merely a warden on the far side of death. She is the line itself, given form and authority, and a hall with named furnishings, and a face that answers any question about which side of the boundary one is standing on. Snorri's account also describes her expression and disposition, and the description is not warm, but it is not cruel. The word he uses for her expression or appearance is downcast or grim, a face turned downward, neither smiling nor welcoming. This has sometimes been read as hostility, but the tradition doesn't support that reading. A face turned downward is not the same as a face turned against. What the description suggests is more like the expression of someone engaged in continuous, serious, and important work. The ruler of a realm that processes the daily mortality of all 9 worlds is not someone whose expression would be expected to convey delight. The grimness is professional. It belongs to the scale of her domain. Her hall, which Snorri names Eljuthnir, a name most often translated as something like sprayed with snowstorms or damp with sleet, holds her seat of authority, and it was in this hall, at Baldur's arrival, that the tradition reveals the most complete picture of how Hel exercises her governance. Baldur was the most beloved of the Aesir. His death, brought about by Loki's orchestration of the blind god Hotur's throw of a mistletoe dart, the one substance that had not sworn to do Baldur no harm, sent a grief through Asgard that the tradition describes in terms of cosmic completeness. Everything mourned. The gods gathered at his funeral on the shore, his great ship Hringhorni launched and set alight, his wife Nanna dying of grief and placed in the fire beside him, his horse and his weapons laid into the flames. And then Baldur descended. He traveled the long road downward, the 9 nights through deep and dark valleys, and he arrived in Eljuthnir. What Snorri records next is precise, and the precision matters. When Hermodr arrived in Hel's hall, Odin's son, riding Sleipnir at Odin's request to plead for Baldur's return, he found Baldur sitting in the seat of honor. Baldr, who had arrived days before, who had descended through the dark and entered the realm where Hel governed, was seated in the position of a distinguished guest, the most honored place in the hall. Hel had received him as a ruler receives someone of extraordinary consequence, not with punishment, not with indifference, but with the specific hospitality due to a figure of his stature, the lord of a realm entertaining a visitor of distinction. The protocol was careful. Hel was not ignoring Baldur's status. She was honoring it within her own domain, according to her own authority. Hermodr spoke his plea. The hall was quiet around him. Nanna was there beside Baldur, having followed her husband down the road, and the tradition records that she gave Hermodr gifts to carry back to Asgard: a linen robe for Frigg, a ring for Fula. These are small, specific details, the kind that suggest the account was told and retold with enough care that the particulars were preserved. A linen robe, a gold ring, gifts given by a dead wife through a living messenger to the gods she had known. The domestic scale of the exchange sitting inside the cosmic scale of the negotiation, both equally present in Snorri's account. Hel listened to Hermodr's request. She did not refuse it. The tradition is careful about this. She did not tell Hermodr that Baldur could not be returned, or that the request was without merit, or that the living had no standing to make such a plea. What she did was issue a condition. If every being in all the 9 worlds, every living thing and every dead thing, every stone and every tree and every creature would weep for Baldur, then she would release him, and he could return to Asgardr. The condition was absolute, and its scope was total. Not a majority, not most things, but everything, all of it without exception. The condition reveals the framework within which Hel operates, and it is not the framework of a figure who acts on whim or from cruelty. The condition is law. It is a rule, and a rule with internal logic. If Baldur's death is so universally mourned that every element of the cosmos registers his loss, then the loss is genuinely universal, and his return can be authorized. The condition is not impossible in principle. The messengers of the gods went out through all 9 worlds, and everything they asked wept. Everything complied. Stone and tree and living animal, the roots of the world and the creatures in the sea, the frost-covered grass on the hillsides of Midgard, and the oldest rocks in the deep places of the earth. All of it wept, the tradition records, and the landscape of the 9 worlds was wet with grief for Baldur. There was one exception, a giantess sitting in a cave who gave her name as Thuk. When the messengers asked her to weep for Baldur, she refused. Her refusal, recorded in the sources as a brief and pointed verse, was total, "Let hell keep what she has." Baldur did nothing for me in life. I will not weep for him. The messengers could do nothing with this. A condition is a condition. One refusal is enough to fail an absolute requirement. The giantess in the cave, whom the tradition strongly suggests was Loki in one of his disguises, the architect of Baldur's death, completing his work with this final refusal, was one entity among all the entities in the cosmos, and her dry eyes undid what every other tear had built. Baldur remained in Eleuthir. The tradition does not describe a second appeal, a renegotiation, a petition for reconsideration. Hel's condition had been issued and had failed. Her custody of Baldur was legally sustained. The grief of all the other gods, the tears of every stone and tree and living creature except one, changed nothing, not because Hel was unmoved by grief, but because the condition she had set was the framework within which her authority operated, and that framework was not subject to override. The grief of Asgarth, her however vast, was not the mechanism by which her decisions could be reversed. Law was, and the law had been tested and had come back incomplete. This is the detail in which Hel's nature as a ruler becomes most legible. She is not a figure who acts from appetite or malice. She does not collect the dead because she desires their company, or retain Baldur out of spite toward the Aesir, or set an impossible condition as a cruelty. She operates within a defined domain, with defined laws, and those laws hold even when the most beloved of the gods is the subject of the case, and even when Odin himself has sent a messenger to plead. The authority that Odin granted her by casting her downward into Niflheim cannot be revoked from above when its exercise becomes inconvenient to those above. That would not be authority. Authority, in the tradition's understanding, means that the domain is genuinely hers, that her decisions within it are final, and that the gods who sent her there must live with the consequences of having created a sovereignty they cannot overturn. There is something worth dwelling on in the relationship between Odin's original act, Kastadi, the casting downward, and the scene in Hermothr's visit. Odin cast Hel into Niflheim and gave her authority over the dead. Odin then, when his most beloved son died and descended to Hel's domain, sent a messenger to ask for that son back. The tradition does not treat this as an irony or a contradiction requiring explanation. It simply records both things. Odin made the domain. Odin's son died and entered it. Odin sent a plea. Hel answered with a condition. The condition failed. These events follow one from another, without commentary in the sources, and the absence of commentary is its own kind of precision. The tradition does not seem to find it surprising that the authority Odin created would operate independently of his wishes. That is what it means to create genuine authority. The creator's preferences cannot overrule the domain once the domain has been established. The Eddic sources are not rich with scenes of Hel speaking, but the scene in which she speaks to Hermoth is among the most completely rendered in the primary material, and it has the quality of a portrait made with very few but very careful marks. She is seated. Balder is at her side in the seat of honor. The hall around them carries the names Snorri has given its furnishings, each one a small, cold, particular word, a ruler in her hall, a distinguished guest beside her, a living visitor standing before her, making the most important argument the living world could make, and Hel listening, and then answering, not with refusal, not with cruelty, but with a condition that is perfectly proportioned to the request. A death universally mourned should be reversible. Show that the mourning is universal, and the reversal will follow. The logic is sound, the condition is fair, within the logic of the realm it comes from. What remains when that logic is followed to its end, when the messengers go out, when everything weeps, when the one exception holds, and the condition fails, is Balder in the seat of honor in Eleuthnir, and Hel continuing in her governance, and the tradition moving forward with the knowledge that the realm of the dead is not a place from which the dead return, except in the particular circumstances of one giantess's compliance, which was not given. The story does not describe Hel changing after this. She continues, "The road still runs downward. The 9 nights are still 9 nights. The dead continue to arrive, and Eleuthnir receives them as it has always received them, and its ruler continues to exercise the authority she was given on the same day she was cast into the dark." The tradition that describes Hel as Blar, divided between the living and the dead, also contains within its larger arc a resolution that does not negate her custody of Bald, but transforms its meaning over the fullest span of the mythological cycle. What the oldest sources hold is this: after the catastrophe of Ragnarok, after the world passes through destruction, and the long winter, and the fire that sweeps the 9 worlds, and the gods fall, who were fated to fall, there is a renewal. A new world rises from the water. The sun's daughter rides the sky, her mother rode, and Bald, the tradition records, returns. He and his brother Hrethur come back together into the reborn world, rising from Hel into the renewed morning of a cosmos that has been remade. Hel's custody of Balder was not permanent in the cosmic sense, though it was absolute within the span of the world as it existed. She held what she was given to hold, for as long as the holding was required, and then the world changed around the holding, and Balder walked out of Eleuthnir into a morning that the old world never saw. This eschatological arc does not diminish Hel's authority. It does not suggest that the condition she set was secretly negotiable, or that the Ardseer eventually found a way around it. What it suggests is that her domain existed within the same larger cycle as everything else in the 9 worlds, that the world tree and the 9 worlds arranged across it, and the road that runs downward to Niflheim, and the hall at the bottom of the road with its furnishings and its ruler and its inhabitants were all part of a structure that had a shape, a duration, and a moment of transformation that no individual act of governance could prevent. Hel held Bald correctly, according to her authority, for the full length of the world as it was, and when the world ended and was remade, what had been held was released into the new morning. That is the shape of the tradition as the oldest sources carry it. A daughter born of the giantess who brings grief, cast downward by the god who made the worlds, given authority over the largest constituency in the cosmos, described in the flesh as the threshold itself, living color on one side and death's color on the other, operating by law in her hall, with its named and cold and particular furnishings, receiving the most beloved of the gods into the seat of honor, setting a condition that was fair and absolute, and ultimately unfulfilled by one refusal, holding Bald through the long years of the world's last age, releasing him in the end, not because the gods persuaded her, but because the world itself changed, and the realm she governed changed with it. The name Hel, held up the same way one holds up Angrabotha's name, Helvegr's name, the name of the road, means simply the covered place, the concealed place, the place beneath. The word is old enough that it roots itself in a Proto-Germanic ancestor that meant the same thing, and from which both the Old English word hell and the modern English word hell eventually descend, though by roots that move through theological frameworks very different from the Norse. In the Norse tradition, the covered place is not primarily a place of punishment. It is primarily a place that receives, for receives the dead because the dead have nowhere else to go, and because the world requires that they go somewhere, and because someone must govern where they go with the attention and the authority that the governance requires. Hel was given that governance. Her name became the name of the place she governed, or the place gave its name to her, and in either direction, the identification is complete. Ruler and realm, so thoroughly the same that the name passes between them without seam. Baldr sits in the seat of honor in Eleuthir. The hall around him carries its particular names, hunger and famine, and the stumbling block and the sickbed, and gleaming misery, the furnishings named for what they mean, the objects pressed into service as a language for what this place is, and what arrives here. And Baldr among them, the most radiant of the Aesir, seated with the courtesies, do a guest of extraordinary distinction in a hall that was not made for gods, but that governs gods when they die, the same as it governs everyone. Hel, attending to him as a ruler, attends to the most notable of those who have come under her authority, neither releasing him nor diminishing him, holding him with the absolute patience of someone for whom time moves differently, someone who has been governing the daily mortality of the 9 worlds since the day she was thrown downward into the dark and given the whole enormous quietness of it to keep. Whatever the tradition understood Hel to be, whatever the Norse who told these stories and received them thought of the figure who waited at the end of the 9-night road, what the oldest sources preserve is a figure of genuine and coherent authority, operating within a domain whose laws she did not make and cannot break, whose face carries in its 2 halves the map of the boundary she was appointed to hold. Not a monster, not a tyrant, a ruler with a throne and a hall, and a jurisdiction that encompasses the great majority of all the dead who ever died under the 9 worlds span. She is sitting in her hall right now, in the world the tradition describes, and Baldr is beside her, and the furnishings carry their cold particular names, and the road above them runs upward through 9 nights of dark valleys, back to the world of the living, and the dead are still arriving, still crossing the long road, still coming to the place that receives them with the solemn and attentive governance that the covered place, the concealed place, the place beneath everything has always offered. The word Gjalla means to ring out. It means to resound, the sound a horn makes when it is blown across open distance, the particular carrying quality of a sound that travels farther than it should, that arrives before the thing that made it has been seen. In Old Norse, the verb holds inside it a specific kind of loudness, not noise, not clatter, but resonance, the note a metal thing makes when it is struck cleanly, and the vibration is allowed to continue. To Gjalla is to send a sound outward and let it go on longer than ordinary sounds go on. This is the name of a river, Gjoll, the river whose name is sound itself, whose name carries inside it the verb for ringing and resounding, runs at the outermost edge of Hel's domain, the last water before the road stops being a road in any ordinary sense and becomes instead the approach to a realm that is not Midgard and is not any of the worlds the living pass through on their way from one thing to the next. The river's name does not describe its color or its temperature or the speed at which it moves. What the name preserves is acoustic. Gjoll is defined by what it sounds like. It is a river that rings. That detail has been carried in the Norse tradition for a very long time, longer than any single manuscript that holds it, longer than the generation that compiled it into the form Snorri Sturluson would later work from when he wrote the Prose Edda. The river Gjoll is a sound first and a body of water second, and sitting with that for a moment, letting it settle before moving past it, seems like the right way to approach a boundary that was always meant to be heard before it was crossed. The name does not stand alone in the tradition. Gjoll and Gjallarhorn share the same root. The horn is Heimdall's boast, the great watchhorn of the Aesir, kept at the edge of the sky, where Heimdall stands his perpetual guard over the threshold of Asgardr, and the horn will be blown at Ragnarok when the boundaries of the world finally fail, and everything the gods have maintained comes to its end. Gala, to ring out. Gjallarhorn, the horn that rings out across the cosmos. Gjoll, the river that rings. The same verbal root, the same quality of sound, appears at the boundary of the ordinary dead and at the boundary of the world's end. Both. The Norse tradition has pressed the same sound word into two different thresholds, and the connection is not coincidental, it is structural. A threshold announces itself by ringing. Whatever the crossing is, at whatever scale, the approach is acoustic first. Gjoll is numbered among the 11 Helvegr, the primordial rivers that flow outward from the spring Helvegr in the depths of Niflheim. Their age in the tradition is immense. These are not rivers that formed when the world was formed. They predate the world's formation. When Snorri records their existence in Gylfaginning, he places them in the cosmological conditions that existed before Odin and his brothers shaped Yggdrasil from Ymir's body, before the 9 worlds were arranged, before the gods built anything. Gjoll was already flowing when there was nothing else to flow through. It ran through the dark of Ginnungagap, thickened with ice at its edges, the way all the Helvegr did in the cold that lay on the northern side of the void. By the time the world existed, by the time Helvegr was a road and not simply a direction, Gjoll had been a river for longer than the tradition can trace. That age gives the river a quality beyond its name. A boundary this old is not arbitrary. It did not come into being because someone decided it was needed. It was already there, already running, already ringing, and what was built on it, the bridge, the guardian, the gate beyond, was built to match what the river had always been. The bridge is Gjallarbru. In Gylfaginning, Snorri describes it as roofed with glowing gold, Luktarg Guli. In the Old Norse, the gold described not simply as present, but as luminous, as catching and holding whatever light exists in the deep dark of the lower road. The bridge takes its name from the river it spans. Gjallarbru, the bridge of Gjoll, the same sound root again, so that the structure is named after its river, and the river is named after the sound it makes. And traveling toward the bridge means traveling toward a resonance that has been echoing in the names of things since the world was very young. Scholars have noted that in the Norse tradition, thresholds of cosmological significance are frequently marked with precious materials and deliberate craftsmanship. The Well of Earther, where the Norns hold the threads of fate, is described as existing beside the root of Yggdrasil in a landscape of careful, formal construction. The well itself attended to, maintained, the setting treated as befitting its function. Gjallarbru's gold thatching belongs to that same tendency. The bridge at the edge of the world of the dead has not been left plain. Someone or something that the tradition does not name gave it a golden roof, made it conspicuous, made it visible in the dark. Whatever travelers approach Gjallarbru in the long dark of Helvegr will see the gold before they are close enough to hear the river. The account that documents all of this most fully in the surviving sources is Hermothr's Crossing, as Snorri records it in Gylfaginning. Hermoth was a son of Odin. When Baldur died, struck by the mistletoe dart that Loki guided through Hother's blind hand, the single thing that could harm him and that no one had thought to include in the oath that should have protected him, the Aesir's grief was the total and immediate kind, the kind that admits no ordinary response. Frigg spoke first. What she asked for was a volunteer, someone willing to ride Helvegr to Hel's Hall and plead for Baldur's return. Hermothr offered. Odin gave him Sleipnir, the eight-legged horse that moves between worlds, the horse that has already made this road before, that knows the quality of the ground under 9 nights of dark valleys in a way that other horses do not. Hermothr mounted and rode 9 nights through the valleys Snorri describes as Dillar ok Myrkvar, deep and dark. The road runs north and downward through the cosmological structure beneath the third root of Yggdrasil, through terrain that provides no reference point, no lightning, no sense of the sky above. Hot, 8 hooves on cold earth. The darkness consistent enough and deep enough that it becomes, after several nights, something closer to a texture than an absence, something with a quality of its own, not the darkness of a room with its lamp out, but the darkness of ground that is genuinely far below the surface of anything that carries light. On the 9th night of that riding, Hermothr arrived at Gjoll. The river rings. The bridge is thatched with gold, and the gold catches something, some residual faint light, or perhaps it is simply that gold generates a visibility of its own, that a surface worked and polished to that degree holds the eye even in conditions that should not allow for it. Hermothr on Sleipnir came down out of the 9th dark valley and found the bridge ahead of him, formal and clearly constructed and conspicuous in its gold, spanning a river whose name he already knew because everyone in the 9 worlds who has listened carefully to what the tradition preserves knows the name of the river at the edge of the dead's country. He rode onto the bridge, and the bridge rang. Snorri records this detail with precision. Gjallarbru sounded more under Hermothr's single crossing than it had under 5 companies of dead men who had crossed it the day before. The Prose Edda is specific: 5 fylki, 5 troops, 5 companies, the word suggesting organized groups moving in formation rather than individuals had crossed Gjallarbru on the preceding day, and their combined passage had made less sound than Hermothr's Sleipnir made in the first moment of crossing. The bridge distinguished between them immediately. It did not require an observer to note the difference. The difference was in the resonance itself. This is worth dwelling on, because what the tradition is describing here is a cosmological principle encoded in the structure of a bridge. The dead in the Norse account do not weigh the world the same way the living do. 5 companies of mortal dead, the full day's passage of souls from across the 9 worlds, crossed Gjallarbru in silence, or in something so close to silence that Snorri draws the contrast sharply enough to make the silence legible by the noise that follows it. Hermoth, living, carrying the full animating substance of a life not yet concluded, carrying breath and blood and the particular insistence of a body still in use, struck the bridge like a bell. The 8 hooves of Sleipnir on gold-thatched wood over the ringing river Gjoll sent a sound out across the dark that the day's entire passage of the dead had not produced. What distinguishes the living from the dead in this moment is not appearance, not warmth, not the sound of breathing or heartbeat. It is weight. Not physical weight. Hermothra on a horse surely weighs more than the collective mass of 5 companies of dead men is difficult to establish. But something the bridge is calibrated to detect, some quality of presence or substance that living things carry in a different measure than the dead, and that Gjallarbru registers as heavier, more insistent, more resonant. The bridge is not simply a bridge, it is, in the way the tradition describes it, a threshold that knows the difference. And at the threshold there is a guardian. Her name is Mothgwither. She is one of the named female figures whose records survive in the tradition, though her origin and nature are not described in detail by Snorri. She appears at this moment, at this bridge, grows, and the tradition gives her a name and a function, and then does not elaborate further on who or what she was before she was set here. The name Mothgwith is a compound. It has been interpreted as something like battle frenzy or fierce fighting mood, Mother meaning something in the range of courage, spirit, battle intensity, the particular quickening of mind that accompanies combat, and Guthra meaning battle or fight. The guardian of the bridge at the edge of the world of the dead carries, in her name, the qualities of a warrior's aroused state. She is not described as performing any act of combat in this account. She stops her mother by speaking to him. She steps forward. The tradition does not specify from where, whether she waited on the bridge itself, or on the far bank, or somewhere else, only that she is present when Hermodr crosses, and she addresses him. Her first question is about identity. Her second is about purpose. And embedded in what she says to him is the detail that makes the encounter one of the more philosophically precise moments in the surviving Norse mythological literature. Mothgwither tells Hermodr that he does not have the look of a dead man. The Old Norse account Snorri preserves has her noting that he is not pale in the way the dead, who had crossed the bridge, were pale, that his appearance marks him as living in a way that she can perceive directly, without being told. This is one of very few passages in the surviving tradition that characterizes, from the perspective of someone stationed at the boundary of the dead's country, what it looks like to approach that boundary alive. The dead arrive pale. The coloring of life has left them, the particular warmth of hue that living flesh carries, and that Snorri elsewhere uses the word blare, the blue-black of death, to describe its absence in its most extreme form. Hermithwa does not have this. He is visibly, legibly, perceptibly living. The bridge knew it by sound. Mothgwa knows it by sight. What the tradition is doing, quietly and without announcing it, is giving the boundary a double sense. Gjoll and Gjallarbru detect the living presence acoustically. Mothgwa confirms it visually. The threshold is thorough. It does not leave the distinction between the living and the dead to chance or to self-report. The road to hell is designed, at its final crossing, to know what approaches it. Hermithwa answered her questions. He named himself, son of Odin, and he named his purpose, to find Baldur, to plead for his return, to bring back to Asgarth, if he could, the most beloved of the gods who had died at the hand of a blind man, guided by a god who found in the event what he had been looking for without knowing it. The account does not record Mothgwad's response to the name in detail. What it records is that she confirmed what Hermithwa needed to know. Baldur had crossed Gjallarbru. She had seen him pass. He had gone forward and downward along the road that continued beyond the river, and she could tell Hermithwa which direction to follow. The exchange has the quality, in Snorri's account, of a formal proceeding at a legitimate boundary. Hrothgar does not attempt to prevent Hermithwa's crossing. She does not threaten him. She questions him, as a guardian at any crossing of significance would question a traveler whose presence departs from the ordinary. And the departure from the ordinary here is not Hermithwa's destination, but his condition, the fact of his being alive on a road that the living do not generally travel. Once he has answered her questions, once the purpose has been stated, the identity given, the exceptional circumstance acknowledged, the crossing proceeds. There is something in that exchange worth holding. The guardian of the bridge at the edge of the dead's country is not an obstacle. She is a function of the threshold's design, a part of what makes the boundary a boundary. Boundaries in the Norse tradition are not simply geographical features. They are administered. Gjallarbru has its Norns. Asgard has Heimdall, the boundary of the dead's country. At the last river before Helgrind has Mothgwa. Someone is always there. Someone has always been there, because the tradition requires that thresholds of cosmological significance be tended rather than merely present. Mothgwa confirmed Baldur's crossing and pointed the way forward. Beyond Gjallarbru, beyond the ringing river and its gold-thatched bridge, and its guardian, who saw through the pallor of the dead to the living color of the visitor, the road continued. It ran downward. It ran toward Helgrind, the gate of hell. Snorri does not describe Helgrind in the way he describes Gjallarbru. The bridge gets its gold. The gate gets a name and a function, and the single remarkable event that it frames. Hermithwa's approach, his dismounting, his practical preparations, and Sleipnir's leap. The name Helgrind means simply the gate or barrier of hell. Grind being a word for a gate or lattice, the kind of barrier that can be seen through but not easily crossed, a thing that marks a boundary without concealing what lies beyond it. Hermithwa arrived at Helgrind on his horse in the dark beyond the river, and he did not try to open it. What Snorri records in Gylfaginning is a sequence of practical actions that give the scene its particular texture. Hermodr dismounted. He tightened Sleipnir's girth. The leather strap that holds the saddle in place, the adjustment that a rider makes before a difficult passage, gathering the horse more firmly under the saddle so that the two of them are as unified in their motion as they can be made. And then he remounted, and then he spurred Sleipnir toward the gate. The horse cleared it, 8 legs gathered and released in the dark, and Sleipnir went over Helgrind in the single leap that carries Hermodr across the final threshold between the world of the living and the world of the dead, not through the gate, which is designed to receive the dead in their particular manner of arrival, and not to open for the living, but over it in the airborne moment that Sleipnir's supernatural capability makes possible. The horse that Loki bore in the form of a mare, the horse that Odin rides across all 9 worlds, the horse with 8 legs because 8 legs carry more of the world's weight than 4. This is the horse that can take a living rider over the gate of hell, and the preparation Hermodr performs before the leap has no ceremony in it. He dismounted, he tightened the girth, he remounted. These are the actions of someone approaching a difficult thing, practically and without theater. The leap itself is a moment of motion that does not linger in Snorri's account. It happens, and then Hermodr is on the other side, in the realm of hell, riding toward Eljuthnir, where he will find Baldur in the seat of honor and Hel in her sovereign place. And all of that is what follows the leap, what comes after the gate, in the country the gate was designed to hold. The gate itself is simply the last threshold. Helgrind stands where the road ends and the realm begins, and Sleipnir went over it in a single motion, and the tradition does not dwell on the landing. What the whole sequence shows, from the bridge to the guardian to the gate, is that the approach to hell is structured rather than open. There are specific points at which the road checks itself, at which the design of the cosmological approach asserts its function. Gjallarbru sounds when the living cross it. Modgwr stands and questions. Helgrin defines the final line. None of these are obstacles in the antagonistic sense. They are not placed to prevent passage, but to mark it, to register it, to ensure that whatever crosses the river and passes the guardian and clears the gate is known and counted and accounted for. The Norse tradition, in its surviving sources, does not describe the approach to the dead's country as a desperate or contested thing. It describes it as a procedure, an old, thoroughly designed, carefully administered procedure whose components have been in place since before the world had its current shape. Hermodr's crossing of Gjallarbru is one of two notable crossings that survive in the primary sources. The other is the ride Odin makes in the Eddic poem Baldr's Draumar, a poem whose title means Baldr's dreams, though it is Odin who does the riding, setting out on Helvegr to question a dead Volva about the meaning of the dreams that have been disturbing Baldr's sleep. The poem begins with Odin already in motion, already on the road. He reaches Osiris buried at the eastern gate of Hell and performs the Scyther, the magic to call her up and compel her answers. The poem's economy of detail does not include a description of Gjoll or Gjallarbru. Odin's crossing of those thresholds is implied rather than narrated, absorbed into the journey's structure rather than recorded as its own event. But the riding of Helvegr is present, the direction of the road is present, and the dark and cold of the 9 nights can be felt in the poem's atmosphere, even when they are not directly described. Between Baldr's Draumar and Gylfaginning, the river and the bridge are established enough in the tradition to serve as known elements present in the background of one account and described specifically in the other, consistent in their character across both, the river ringing and the bridge spanning it, and the approach to the dead's country proceeding through both of them in an order that does not vary. Helvegr runs 9 nights. Gjoll runs at the end of it. Gjallarbru spans Gjoll. Modgwr stands at the bridge. And beyond the bridge, the road continues to Helgrind and then into the realm itself. The tradition preserves the names of these landmarks carefully. This is worth noticing because names in the Norse cosmological system are not decorative. They are taxonomic, functional, sometimes etymologically loaded with the quality of the thing they name. Gjoll, the ringing river. Gjallarbru, the bridge of the ringing river. Modgwr, the fierce battle mood. Helgrind, the gate of hell. Every component of the approach to hell's domain has been given a name, and the names have been maintained in the tradition across the centuries of oral transmission and manuscript compilation that separate the events described from the sources that describe them. Someone thought it mattered to keep the names of the river and the bridge and the guardian and the gate. The tradition agreed and passed them forward. The 5 companies of dead who crossed Gjallarbru on the day before Hermodr arrive in the account as a way of establishing the bridge's scale. Snorri does not name the 5 companies. He does not identify what dead they were, or from which of the 9 worlds they came, or on what day of what year from the perspective of any calendrical system the tradition uses. They are simply present in Modgwr's account as a measure. This many dead, on one day, produced less resonance than one living rider on one horse. The 5 companies establish by their silence on the bridge the magnitude of Hermodr's sound. They also establish something else, that the bridge at the edge of Hell's domain is in continuous use. The dead do not arrive at Gjallarbru only in notable narrative moments. They arrive every day, in groups, in numbers sufficient to constitute 5 companies in a single day's count. And the bridge receives them as it has always received them, and Mothgwather stands her post, and the river below rings with whatever quality of sound a river whose name is sound itself makes when the dead cross above it in their daily procession. There is something in that image worth sitting with. The bridge is not a landmark that exists only when Hermother arrives to cross it. The bridge is not a narrative convenience, a set piece assembled for the story of Balder and Hermother, and then dissolved when the story moves on. In the world the tradition describes, Gjallarbru is continuously operational. While the Aesir were mourning on Midgard, while Frigg was asking for volunteers, and Hermo was accepting, and Odin was giving him Sleipnir, and the horse was being made ready. During all of that, on the far side of 9 nights of dark valleys, Gjallarbru was doing its daily work. The 5 companies were crossing. Modgr was asking her questions, or not asking them, recognizing the dead for what they were, and letting them pass without the interrogation she applied to Hermo. The river was ringing, or as near to ringing as it rings under the weight of the dead, which the tradition implies is a sound so quiet that 5 companies of them cannot match a single living rider's resonance. The gold of the bridge thatching persists in the dark above all of this. Lugtorguli, the phrase Snorri uses, has been translated in various ways, but the quality all the translations try to capture is light-producing rather than merely decorative. The gold is not simply gold-colored. It is described as glowing, as luminous, as catching whatever illumination exists in the deep valleys of the lower road, and holding it and giving it back, a bridge that glows faintly gold in the dark at the edge of the ringing river. The craftwork in that image is deliberate. The bridge was made to be seen from a distance. It was made so that a traveler coming down out of the 9th dark valley, whether that traveler is Hermo on Sleipnir or one of the 5 companies on the day before, or any of the numberless companies on every day before that, since the world began, will see the gold before they arrive, will know what they are approaching before they hear the river beneath it, or see Mothgr at her post. The scholars who have thought about this detail have connected it to a broader Norse tendency to mark the most consequential thresholds with visible and precious things. The bridge at the edge of the dead's country gets gold. The mark of its importance is not its plainness, but its conspicuousness, the deliberate making visible of a thing whose function the entire tradition understands to be fundamental and permanent. Gjallarbru will stand until the world ends. It will receive the dead of every world, for as long as the worlds produce dead to receive. In that span, the gold thatching is not extravagant. It is appropriate. Rivers function as liminal boundaries throughout the Norse tradition in ways that go beyond the specific case of Gjoll. The gods ride across rivers to reach the council of the Aesir. Snorri describes them crossing rivers to reach Erdharbrun at the base of Yggdrasil. The Norse sources, noting that no one crosses by bridge to the holy places, that rivers must be ridden or waded, that the crossing is part of the arrival. Water marks transitions in the cosmological geography of the tradition, because water is the substance that does not hold its boundaries, that moves, that separates and rejoins, that reflects the sky while being nothing like the sky. Gjoll, at the edge of Hel's domain, is the culmination of that pattern. Every river the Norse tradition uses as a threshold finds its final expression here. At the outermost river, the one that runs at the edge of the country, that does not return travelers to where they came from. Beyond Gjoll, the direction is only one way for the ordinary dead. The river is the last thing they cross that exists on the same cosmological level as the rivers they knew in the worlds above. After Gjoll, the geography is different in kind. Mjolnir pointed the way forward. The tradition does not record what she said precisely. Snorri's account gives the sense of the exchange rather than its word-for-word content. But the direction she indicated was down and north, and further into the dark, along the road that continues beyond the bridge to where Helgren stands, and beyond Helgren to where Eljuthnir stands, and in Eljuthnir to where Baldur was sitting in the seat of honor, attended to in the correct way. Waited on with the courtesies due a distinguished guest in a hall whose every furnishing had been named for a kind of endurance, Hermothra rode forward. Sleipnir carried him beyond the gold-thatched bridge, beyond the guardian's post, along the road on the far side of the ringing river, toward the gate. The dark on this side of Gjoll is the dark that exists entirely within the realm of the dead, separated from the darkness of the approach by the river and the bridge and the crossing that marked the transition between them. The same cold, the same deep narrow valleys, or something like them. The tradition does not describe the geography of the road between Gjallarbru and Helgrind in the same detail it gives to the 9 nights before the river, perhaps because that stretch of road is even less a part of the world where narrative observation ordinarily applies. And then the gate, and the practical preparations, and the leap. Sleipnir's 8 legs carried the sound of a living rider across a gold-thatched bridge over a ringing river, and then cleared the gate of the dead's country in a single gathered motion, and then Hermon was inside, in Eljuthnir, at the court of the ruler of those who died in their beds, and in the fields, and of old age, and of illness, and of every kind of death that is not the death of the battle-chosen, which is to say, the court of the vast majority of all who have ever died in every world, the cosmological structure of the Norse tradition holds. He found Baldbreth in the seat of honor. He spent the night there in the hall, whose threshold is named Stumbling Block, and whose dish is named Hunger, and whose knife is named Famine, and in the morning he made his plea, and the ruler of that hall heard him and gave her answer. But that is what happens when the crossing is finished, what occurs after Gjoll has been forded, and Gjallarbru has rung, and Modgwth has pointed forward, and Helgrind has been cleared in the 8-legged leap that only Sleipnir can make. The river itself, the bridge itself, the exchange at the threshold between the guardian and the living rider, who should not have been there at all. These are what mark the end of the road and the beginning of the realm, the last geography of the approach that has its own character, distinct from everything on either side of it. Gjoll runs. Gjallarbru catches what light there is and gives it back gold. Modgwth stands at her post in the dark above the ringing water. And the 5 companies of the dead, and the 5 companies of the day before, and the day before that, and back through every day since the world's formation, when the river was already old, and the threshold was already administered, and the gold of the bridge was already luminous above water that had been ringing since before anyone was there to hear it. The 5 companies come down off the road and cross the bridge in their continuous and unhurried procession, and the bridge makes no sound, and the river rings below them, and Modgwth watches from her post as they move forward into the realm that was made for them, the realm that has always been there, patient and quiet and immeasurably old, waiting at the end of the road that runs downward and north through 9 nights of dark valleys, to this river and this bridge and this guardian, and then beyond, into the country of the quiet dead. Gjallarbru appears in Snorri Sturluson's account with a detail that is easy to pass over and difficult to forget once noticed. The bridge has a roof, not a simple span of stone or timber thrown across a river in the dark, but a structure with a ceiling, and that ceiling is thatched with glowing gold. The Old Norse phrase Snorri uses is Luktraguli, roofed with gold, or sealed over with it, and the image arrives in the text with the same plain confidence as any other geographical fact. This is what the bridge looks like. This is what is above the traveler who crosses it. This is the material of the threshold between the world of the living and the world of the dead. After 9 nights of riding through valleys described only as deep and dark, through corridors of stone where no sky is visible and no light accumulates, the gold thatching of Gjallarbru would have been the first bright thing. Not blinding, not warm in the way fire is warm, but present and deliberate and constructed to last at the edge of the most permanent thing in the Norse cosmological world. The bridge spans the river Gjoll, and the river's name, as carried in the Old Norse verb gjalla, means to ring out, to resound, to sound loudly, in a way that carries. It is the same root that produces Gjallarhorn, the great horn that Heimdallr keeps at the edge of the world for the purpose of sounding it at Ragnarök, when the 9 worlds are ending and every being in them needs to know that the last river before Hel's domain should share its name with the horn of final announcement is not in the Norse tradition a coincidence of sound. These word roots were understood to carry meaning across the things they named. Gjoll rings, Gjoll resounds, the river at the border of death and the horn at the border of the world's survival share a quality, the quality of a sound that marks an irrevocable passage, a transition from which there is no ordinary return. The river does not merely flow, it sounds continuously in the dark below the gold-thatched bridge, the way a horn sounds, the way a bell sounds, the way certain rivers do sound at night, when their water moves fast across stone, and the walls of the valley hold the noise and give it back. Snorri places the bridge precisely in Hermodr's journey. Hermodr riding Sleipnir, Odin's 8-legged horse, whose gait is unlike any other creature's gait, and whose capacity for passage between worlds is documented across the sources, had ridden for 9 nights through the deep, dark valleys of Helvegr, the road that runs downward and northward through the cosmological structure beneath Yggdrasil's third root. He was riding to plead for Baldr's return. Baldred, son of Odin and Frigg, the most beloved of the gods in the account Snorri gives, had been killed by a spear of mistletoe, guided by Loki's hand and Hodr's blind throw, and had descended into Hel's domain in the ordinary way of the Norse dead, downward and northward, through the same deep valleys, arriving at the same threshold. Hermodr's journey was an attempt to do what the Norse tradition almost never permits, to travel into the realm of the dead as a living being, make a case to its sovereign, and bring someone back. 9 nights of riding, and then the gold-thatched bridge materializing out of the dark ahead of him, and the river below it sounding in the way its name promised it would sound. The bridge was guarded. Her name was Mothgr, and it is one of the more interesting features of the account that Snorri names her at all and gives her speech. Mothgr's name is a compound that can be read as fierce battle mood or something close to battle frenzy, a formidable compound for the guardian of a crossing that serves the dead who arrive in no condition to be fought. She is described as a maiden, and she stops Hermodr with a question. The bridge, she tells him, had sounded differently under him than it had under the 5 companies of dead men who had crossed it the day before. 5 companies. Not 5 individuals, not a handful of travelers, but 5 organized groups, all the dead of the previous day, from across the 9 worlds, channeled to this single bridge, crossing in formation in the way that people moving together across a threshold seem instinctively to do. And Mothgr had felt the bridge respond to Hermodr's crossing with more sound, more resonance, more weight registered in the structure of the span than those 5 companies together had produced. She could tell, from the quality of the bridge's response, that the figure approaching her was carrying something the dead do not carry. She could tell he was alive. This detail, the bridge registering living weight differently than dead weight, belongs to a small category of passages in the Norse sources that characterize what the dead have become in physical terms. The 5 companies of the dead crossed the bridge in silence, the gold thatching above them, the river sounding below, and the bridge itself gave nothing back. The dead have shed whatever it is that makes living bodies leave impressions, makes them sound floors, makes them cause wood to flex and stone to register. They cross in numbers far exceeding any single living rider, and the bridge does not speak. Hermod, alone on an 8-legged horse, crosses and the bridge rings out under him. The river below already carries its own resonance. The structure above adds the resonance of living passage. Mothgorth steps forward and asks who he is. She does not bar the crossing. She asks the question that is appropriate to her position. Who are you? Why are you here? Why does the bridge sound under you as it sounds under the living rather than the dead? Hermodr gives his name. He gives his lineage, son of Odin, sent by the Aesir. He tells her he is looking for Baldred, and Mothguther confirms what he could not have known from his side of the bridge, that Baldred had already crossed. She had seen him pass. She directs Hermodr forward and downward, the road continuing beyond Gjallarbru into the realm she guards the entrance to, the direction always the same, always downward, and to the north. The exchange between them is formal and brief. It is not warm, and it is not hostile. It is the exchange appropriate to a legitimate boundary, properly maintained, between a guardian doing her function and a traveler who has made his purpose known. There is something in this exchange worth dwelling on, the particular quality of Mothgwaf's role. She does not appear elsewhere in the surviving Norse sources. She has no myth beyond this moment, no genealogy recorded, no other function described. She exists in the tradition precisely here, at this crossing, and what the tradition gives her is a name, a power of discernment, the ability to hear in the bridge's resonance, the difference between the living and the dead, and the authority to ask questions and receive answers before she permits passage to continue. She represents a kind of knowledge that does not need a long story behind it. She knows what living presence sounds like. She has been listening to the bridge for as long as the bridge has been standing, and the bridge has been standing since before the gods made the world from Yrmir's body, since the Helvegr rivers flowed outward from Helvegr in the dark of Niflheim, and Gjoll was among them, sounding in the cold as rivers sound. The road beyond Gjallarbru continues. Hermodr, and after Mothgwaf directed him forward, after the exchange at the bridge, after the crossing, after the river fell away behind him, and the gold of the thatching faded into the dark behind and above. The road runs to Helgrind. This is the gate, or the barrier that stands at the approach to Hel's domain, and the word grind in the compound carries the sense of a grating or a lattice, a structure designed to bar passage through it, rather than around it. The dead do not require a gate opened for them. A gate designed to admit the dead can be understood to function the way gates for the dead tend to function in mythological accounts across traditions, passively, receiving those who are meant to enter without obstruction, while remaining firmly itself before anyone who is not. What Hermod does at Helgrind is one of the more precisely described actions in Snorri's account of the journey, and it is described with an almost practical specificity that keeps the scene from becoming otherworldly in the wrong way. He dismounts, he tightens Sleipnir's girth, he remounts, and then Sleipnir clears the gate in a single leap without touching it. The sequence is deliberate. The dismounting and girth tightening is what a skilled rider does before asking a horse for a difficult effort, a brief practical preparation, a moment of attention to the real demands of what comes next. There is no invocation here, no magic spoken aloud, no ritual performed. The preparation is equestrian, specific, and ordinary in every respect except that it precedes a horse jumping over the gate of the land of the dead. Sleipnir's 8 legs gather. The gate passes below. The realm beyond opens. Sleipnir is described across the Norse sources as the finest of all horses, born of Loki's transformation into a mare and his union with the stallion Svathilfari. He is Odin's horse. He travels between worlds because he was always capable of traveling between worlds. His 8 legs and his particular gait are not explained as magical additions, but as what he simply is, the way some horses are simply faster or steadier than others, except that in Sleipnir's case, this quality extends across the cosmological structure rather than merely across terrain. The leap over Helgrind is one of the cleaner demonstrations in the sources of what Sleipnir can do. The gate is designed to receive the dead, who do not leap over it. The gate has no account for a living horse with 8 legs carrying a living rider on a journey made of grief and loyalty, and the hope that Hell's sovereignty might have some conditional edge that could be reached through the right approach. Sleipnir provides the approach. The gate is below, and then it is behind, and then Hermother is in the realm of the dead, on a horse that does not belong there, carrying everything that living presence carries, the bridge already a long way back behind him. Hell's Hall, Eljuthnir, the name carries the sense of something sprayed or damp with sleet. A name that describes weather rather than architecture receives him. Baldur is there. Snorri records that Baldur had been seated in the place of honor within the hall, the position reserved for a distinguished guest, and that Hermothr spent the night in the hall before approaching Hel the following morning to make his case. There is a quiet formality to this arrangement that the account does not explain, but that the account clearly intends. Baldur sits in the hall of the dead, in the seat appropriate to someone significant and respected, and the hall holds him in the way that Hell's domain holds all those who are brought to it, not cruelly, not with the apparatus of punishment, but simply and finally, because this is where the dead are kept, and because Hell's authority over them is not a cruelty, but a condition of the world's structure. Hell's response to Hermothr's plea is in the account Snorri gives, the clearest demonstration of how her sovereignty operates. She does not refuse him. She does not close the conversation. She offers a condition, the condition that every being in all the 9 worlds, living and dead, must weep for Baldur, and that if this condition is met, Baldur will be released. The condition is possible to fulfill. It is not impossible by design. The gods receive it and send their messengers out across the 9 worlds, and the world responds. Everything weeps, stone weeps, trees weep. Every creature in the innumerable categories of living things complies, and the account makes clear that the compliance is genuine. The world loved Baldur, or was willing to express the loss of him in the terms Hel specified. Everything weeps except one, a giantess named Thok, encountered by the messengers in a cave, refuses. Her refusal is complete and final, and Snorri's account strongly implies that Thok was Loki in another shape, adding to Loki's long tally of the consequences he set in motion. Because the condition requires every being without exception, the single refusal undoes it. Baldry stays, and this is the shape of the matter, as the tradition holds it. Not a failure of love or effort, not a cruelty on Hel's part, She offered a genuine condition, and the condition was genuinely close to met. A single refusal in a cave, a single cold voice declining, and Bald remained in the hall where he had been seated in the place of honor, attended to with the courtesies due a remarkable guest. In the realm below the third root of Yggdrasil, below the dark valleys, beyond the gold-thatched bridge over the ringing river, in the hall, whose name means damp with sleet, and whose furnishings have names that mean hunger and famine, and the stumbling block, and the sickbed, and a kind of gleaming misery. He remained there. The hall continued to be what it had always been, and Baldur continued to be its most distinguished resident, and Hel's authority held as it had always held, not because she is cruel, but because the condition of the world requires it to hold. The Völuspá, the poem of the seeress that looks forward through time to the events of Ragnarok and beyond, carries a detail about Baldur that the tradition offers quietly, without particular emphasis, as part of its larger account of what comes after the world ends and begins again. After Ragnarok, after the great dissolution, the fire and the sea, and the gods who fall, the world rises again from the water, green described in the Völuspá with the specificity of something genuinely imagined and not merely hoped for. And in that renewed world, Baldur returns. He and his brother Höður, who struck the blow that killed him, guided by Loki, deceived by the one weapon that had been left out of Frigg's oath-making, come back together. They come back to each other and to the world that has been remade, the long residence in Hel's hall, not erased but resolved, the time kept in that quiet domain becoming, in retrospect, a period of waiting and preservation rather than permanent loss. Baldur in Eleuthir was not gone. He was held. The hall that kept him correctly, according to the rules that govern such keeping, and when the rules of the world itself shifted at the great transition, the tradition calls the end and the beginning, the keeping released him in the natural course of things. This is not comfort added to the story after the fact. The Völuspá is an old poem among the oldest witnesses to Norse cosmological thought that survives, and Baldur's return is embedded in its account of the renewed world as a single specific detail among many. He comes back. Höður comes back. The world that was remade has room for them. The hall that held Baldur for the long age between his death and Ragnarok. The hall with its named furnishings, its gold thatching faintly lit, its river sounding below. Let him go when the larger structure of the cosmos released the conditions that had made his staying necessary. His time in the realm of the dead was not outside the pattern of the world. It was part of it. The pattern is longer than any single life or death within it. Gjallarbru stands in the tradition as something that functions, not as a symbol, not as an image constructed for a reader's benefit, but as a structure with a documented daily operation. 5 companies of the dead, the previous day, had crossed it. 5 companies from across the 9 worlds, all the days dead, arriving at the bridge in the way the dead arrive at boundaries, without the weight of living presence, without making the bridge sound under them, without triggering Moldguthr's question. The crossing is continuous. It has been continuous since before the gods made the world, and will be continuous until the world ends. Every death that occurs anywhere in the Norse cosmological structure, every death that is not the honorable combat death that brings a warrior to Valhall, arrives eventually at Gjallarbru, crosses the gold-thatched span above the sounding river, and continues down the road to Hel's domain. The scale implied by 5 companies in a single day, multiplied across the age of the world, is difficult to hold in ordinary terms, but the bridge holds it. The bridge has been holding it since the rivers flowed out of Helvegr, and Gjoll was among them, and the water found its way to the low place where a structure would one day be built across it, gold-thatched and formal, at the edge of the quiet country where the dead come to rest. What the tradition gives Gjallarbru, in the detail of its gold thatching, is a kind of dignity that the location might not seem to require. A bridge serving the dead, at the end of a 9-night road through dark valleys, could be imagined as plain, functional, unmemorable, but Luktergulli, the gold that seals the roof, is not accidental. The Norse tradition marks thresholds of cosmic significance with precious materials and careful craft. Bifrost, the rainbow bridge between Midgard and Asgard, burns with fire and color visible across the world. Brunn, the well of fate beneath Yggdrasil, where the Norns weave, is surrounded by a whiteness, described as chalk or alabaster, the ground around it immaculate. Gjallarbru, at the edge of Hell's domain, has its gold thatching, catching whatever faint light reaches the lower road, visible from a distance to anyone approaching along the dark way from Helvegr, a marker of the threshold's importance constructed into the bridge itself, so that it cannot be mistaken for something ordinary. The dead do not notice the gold above their heads. The gold is not for them. The gold is a record of what the tradition thought this threshold deserved, the same quality of attention it brought to every boundary of consequence. After Hermothur's cleared Helgrind on Sleipnir's back, and rode into the hall to spend the night there, and after he made his case to Helgrind the following morning, and received her condition, and after the condition was carried across the 9 worlds by messengers who asked everything to weep, and found that everything would, and after Thuk refused in her cave with what amounts to the tradition's most consequential single act of coldness, after all of this, Gjallarbru was still standing. Hermod returned across it on his way back to Asgard, back to the world where Odin and Frigg and all the Aesir were waiting to hear what Hel had said. The bridge received his crossing the same way it had received his first crossing, with resonance, with the sound of living weight registering in the golden structure above the ringing river, with Mothgwath present at her post in the way she is always present. He crossed back. The road ran upward from the bridge instead of down, the 9 nights in reverse, the valleys rising rather than deepening, until Helvegr brought him back to the surface of the world, and the news he carried came with him. The bridge remained. The dead continued to arrive along the road, in their companies, crossing without weight enough to sound the bridge, moving through the gold-thatched span, and continuing into the domain beyond it. Mothgwath continued to stand at the approach, attentive to the quality of sound the bridge produces under each passage, noting the living and the dead by this single measure. The river below continued to sound in the particular way that the name Gjoll promises, that long, resonant ringing in cold air that the Old Norse verb Gjolla carries, the same quality that Heimdallr's great horn will carry when the time for its sounding comes, the sound that marks the passages that cannot be reversed. Until that sounding, the river sounds as it has always sounded. The bridge stands over it as it has always stood. The gold of the thatching is as it was when the bridge was made. There is a particular quality to things in the Norse tradition that have been in continuous operation since before the world was formed from Ymir's body. Warvergolmir, the spring in Niflheim from which the Helvegr rivers flow, existed before creation. Gjoll was one of those rivers. If the conditions that produce the river, that produces the sound that gives the bridge its character, are older than the Aesir, older than Yggdrasil, older than the arrangement of the 9 worlds across the branches and roots of the great tree. It runs through valleys described as deep and dark, in the language that the sources preserve, and the darkness of the valleys is not a danger, but a geography, the particular geography of the passage between the world of the living and the world of the dead. a passage that takes the time it takes